Hi, everybody. Maria Carter Giannini here for our third California history lesson. This one is all about how California became a state. So we'll be taking a look at what happens before we become a state, what that process looks like, and how that was impacted by the Compromise of 1850 and the Civil War. So lots of ground to cover. And you can see I've bolded the skills that we're going to be working on today. So a little chronology and sequence practice, some claim practice, and then an art activity at the end. So events that lead California to become a state, the Mexican-American War, which happens between 1846 and 1848. So we become an American territory as a result of that. Gold is discovered near the Sacramento area in 1848, so starting the gold rush at Sutter's Mill. So that leads thousands of people coming to California. And they're coming here for a lot of different reasons, but some of the biggest reasons, not just hoping to strike it rich, was the availability of cheap land and good weather. So there's no tornadoes, no blizzards or anything like that. So a very kind of nice place to come and live. So what is this process like? So how does a territory become a state if it's in the 1800s? So the first thing that needs to happen is you need to have a certain amount of people. So you need to have over 60,000 people living in that territory. And then you put it up to a vote. So the people of that territory will vote on whether or not they want to try to join the Union of the United States of America. So this is a process called referendum. So referendum just means you're voting yes or you're voting no. If they vote yes, then you need to send representatives or delegates to write a state constitution, and then they would send that to the Congress of the United States. And during the 1800s, in the state constitution, the state needed to decide whether they were going to try to come in as a slave state or a free state. Then once Congress receives that document, then they can decide, do we even want to add another state to the Union? So lots of states were added before California comes to the party here. So we obviously start with our first original 13 that come in. So that's a little bit of a different process there, but we can see this little animation here to see how they're all coming in. Note Massachusetts is combined with what modern day Maine is. So these are still our original 13 colonies coming in. We've got Pennsylvania, New York coming in, Virginia. You'll notice there's no West Virginia yet. Yes, we've got most of our eastern seaboard is covered there. Kentucky and Tennessee come in, Ohio, so that was called the Northwest Territory. Louisiana will come in. A lot of these other states that come in now are all part of the Louisiana Purchase territory that we get from France. So Missouri, we'll talk a little bit more about Missouri later today. Florida comes in, and big old Texas. And there's California 1850. So that's going to be our focus for today, obviously, this being a California history lesson. And then we'll obviously fill in the rest of these, with the last one being Hawaii coming in 1950s. Okay, so that gets us to where we need to be. Important to have a conversation about slavery and how that is all playing in with what's happening here. So most students, I think, by this point have been at least introduced to the idea of slavery and the slave trade. So I think it's valuable to ask your student what they've talked about in class about that. And that'll give you a nice starting point. And so we started talking today about the slave trade, that the slave trade starts relatively early, is really starting in the 1400s and 1500s, but doesn't come to American shores really until 1619. So that is the first year that the slave ships arrive on our borders. So on that year, and for 4 centuries after that, Black men and women are being captured from Africa, and they're being sold as property and being taken to the Americas. So not just America, but all of what would be considered the New World. So over that long period of time, over 15 million Africans were kidnapped and sold into slavery. They're packed onto extremely crowded ships and they're sent to the New World. So this is a map that I use with my high school students as well, and I do think it's a valuable resource for sure. So you can see that for the most part, they're all being taken from the Ivory Coast area there, so the western coast of Africa, and then we can see percentages of where they're ending up. And we notice that one of the smallest percentages is to modern day United States. So the vast majority of slaves are actually coming to the West Indies and Brazil. And that is because of the sugar plantations that are being run there. And life expectancy was not very long with the sugar plantation process. And so that's part of the reason why you see such larger numbers there versus the ones that are coming to the United States. So slave trade is profitable and extremely cruel. It's a terrible thing that is happening, but there are people that are making a lot of money off of this process. So the way that it works is that these Africans are, for the most part, being sold to farmers, plantation owners. So they're working on plantations. The most common ones are tobacco plantations, partially because that crop was so labor intensive, and that crop basically went year round. So that's why they're utilizing slave labor in the southern states versus the northern states. So we're going to see more industry, banking, things like that in the north. The important for students to understand that they were not considered people. They were considered property. They were considered things. They were things that transferred with ownership. So if the owner died, the slaves would be transferred in a will like other physical property would be. They're forced to work very long hours with no pay, very little food, poor clothing. They're not allowed to go to school. In some states, we'll see slave codes where it is illegal to teach slaves to learn to read and write. We do have exceptions of that. I think it's a valuable experience to talk about someone like Frederick Douglass, who's his master did teach him, the master's wife rather, taught him to read and write. So that there were some exceptions there. And that if slaves had children, they were also property. So we're going to be talking about two different compromises today. And so I think it's valuable to start with, what does that word mean, compromise? Because that's a really big word, especially for our fourth graders. So I had a few kids when I ran the lesson live this morning that knew what compromise was, but not many. So I had them think about, have your parents ever told you you need to figure out how to compromise? So usually this is when two sides can't agree on something, and so you come up with a compromise. So compromise usually means that both sides are giving up something so that you can go on kind of coexisting. Okay, so both sides give up something so that they can get along together. So that's going to take us to the Mason-Dixon line. So this is kind of a magical line in American history. So this is a line where the states of Pennsylvania and Maryland stopped and started. So a lot of people between these two states couldn't agree on where they stopped and started. And so they come up with this line. And so we'll watch a video here to get more on this.
The Mason-Dixon line is a line marking the borders between the states of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon surveyed this borderline between 1763 and 1767. They wanted to solve a disagreement over boundaries between the British and colonial Americans. The disagreement was over where the Maryland and Pennsylvania borders were exactly. William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania, and it was signed over to him by Charles II. As the years went on, there were arguments over exactly where the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland was, and thus where the colonists' loyalties lied. In came Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, who surveyed the land and decided precisely where the borders were. Both men were astronomers and were familiar with the equipment needed to determine the proper line. Later, Congress used the line as part of the Missouri Compromise in 1820 to separate slave states and free states. Today, many Americans consider the Mason-Dixon line a symbolic border between people, politics, and ways of life of Northerners and Southerners.
Okay, so that gives you an overview of the Mason-Dixon line and where that comes from. And so the name that we use is from the two people that actually survey it and then create this line. So you can see from the image here, so it's really kind of bordering Pennsylvania here and Maryland, and then it just gets extended all the way across. So that's going to take us to the Compromise of 1820. This is also sometimes referred to as the Missouri Compromise. So this Mason-Dixon line is now the way we're going to decide which states come in free and which states come in slave. So slave states are states where slavery is legal. So we start using the Mason-Dixon line. So if you were a state that was coming in north of that line, it was assumed that you were going to be coming in as a free state. States below that line would be coming in as a slave state. This does not change anything about states that already have slavery that is legal. So it's only applying to new states. So this is what our map looks like after the Compromise of 1820. You can see your 3630 line, so that's the latitude. And so again, that's just the extension of the Mason-Dixon line. So all of the blue states there are northern states, and those are our free states. And then the red, or kind of the pink color there, those are slave states. You'll notice Missouri is above the Mason-Dixon line. So that was the agreement. Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state. And so that's the compromise that is made there. So now California is getting ready to apply for statehood because there are so many people that are living there and we want to be a part of the union. So we are going to petition to join the nation, but the problem is that there's an equal number of slave states and there's an equal number of free states. So there are 15 and 15. So we want to try to keep that as even as possible. And so California is going to tip the balance on that proverbial scale. So there are no slaves in California prior to our statehood application. And so we are going to try to come in as a free state, but here's the problem. If you extend that Mason-Dixon line all the way across California, that doesn't work because California is such a large state. We are both above and below the Mason-Dixon line. So unless we were going to split California into two different states, that Mason-Dixon line is not going to work anymore because we don't want to come in as a slave state. So this is the first real time that southern states are starting to threaten to secede during this time. So what does that word secede mean? So secede means to leave. So they want to leave the Union. They want to form their own nation. And really the only reason that the Civil War doesn't happen here instead of in 1861 is because of Henry Clay. So he has had a long reputation of compromises. In fact, he's called the Great Compromiser during this time period. And so he convinces his fellow Southern legislatures to be patient and try to work things out with the northern states. Even though Henry Clay is from Kentucky, he's from a southern state, he owns slaves himself, but he considers himself a Union man. He wants to keep the nation together. So it really is large thanks to Henry Clay that they do not secede. So they do come up with another compromise. So this is the Compromise of 1850. So now for my high school students there, they have to know all 5 pieces of the compromise, but I think that's a bit much for our fourth graders. So I told them today that there's a lot to this, but the only things that we really need to focus on in terms of California is that California is going to be allowed to come in as a free state, but there's a but. So here's the compromise piece. The Fugitive Slave Act is going to be passed. So what this means is that if there is a slave that escapes from a southern state and goes into a northern one, either traveling by themselves or through a group like the Underground Railroad, they're going to be sent back. And anyone that is found to be helping escape slaves is going to be brought to justice. So they might be arrested, they might go to jail. So this makes a lot of people really nervous and a lot of people very upset. So it's definitely kind of a catalyst. It's very much going to get a lot more people involved in groups like the Underground Railroad. to try to eradicate slavery. So this compromise certainly isn't perfect, but it is going to delay the start of the Civil War by about 10 years. Right, and then this is what our map looks like now with California in there as a free state in 1850. So we make it, we become the 31st state on September 9th, 1850. There's a big party, lots of parades, lots of celebrations. They're going to make a new flag that now has 31 stars on it. But our first problem is, where are we going to put the capital city? So every state has a capital, so that's where, you know, the legislature is going to be meeting to make laws and things like that. So the absolutely first capital was in Monterey. So if you've ever been in the Monterey Bay Aquarium, you've been to Monterey, so that's where one of the first capitals was. And in fact, that's where we write the Constitution. The state constitution is written in Monterey. And then it shifts to San Jose. But San Jose really isn't a city built for this. It was a lot of farmland. There's not a lot of buildings really at this time in San Jose. And then there's a big rainstorm that comes through, and San Jose basically just turns into one big muddy puddle. And so they start moving it around some more. So it will leave San Jose, it'll go to Benicia, it'll go to Vallejo for about a month, and then it will settle on the city of Sacramento in 1854, where it still is today. All right, this is a good time to practice some chronology. So I put 5 events here up on the slide. So see if your student can put these in order. California becomes a state. Mason-Dixon line is used to decide which states come in free or slave. The gold rush occurs. Sacramento becomes the capital city of California. And the Mexican War occurs and California becomes a US territory. So give them a minute or two to read through those and try to figure out which one comes first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And there's your answers there. Again, this is really just to set us up to do some sequencing sentences. Okay, so this is something that I know my 4th grader has come home with lots of sequencing worksheets, so that's what we're going to do here. So see if they can write a sentence about what's happening first, what's happening next, and what's happening last. So this was a student example from earlier today. So first, the Mexican War takes place to make California a US territory. Second, the gold rush occurs so that everyone is coming to California. Finally, California becomes a state. So a good example of sequence. All right, so let's talk about state symbols. It's a good time to ask if your student knows what our state flower is, or state tree is, or the state bird. When I did this lesson this morning, lots of people knew that our state flower was the California poppy. So that was good. The state tree is the California redwood, and our state bird is the California quail. So your student might think that it's the bald eagle. So I explained the difference between our national bird and our state bird. I think it's always a fun time to introduce the idea that Ben Franklin wanted our official national bird to be the turkey. He thought that turkeys were exceptionally intelligent creatures and thought they would be a great symbol for the United States of America, but he is outvoted on that one. So we have the bald eagle. All right, so this is the California state flag. So the one on the right was actually the original, and then the one on the left is our current California flag. And so I think that's a fun time to kind of say, well, why do we have a grizzly bear on our state flag? What is that all about? And so it really is all about the Bear Flag Revolt of 1846. So there were Americans living in California when this was under the control of Mexico, so before the Mexican-American War. So this is an area called Alta California at this time. And so they're not really liking some of the rules that the Mexican government is passing on them. So they want them to become Mexican citizens. Slavery is outlawed in Mexico at this time, so they want people to stop bringing any kind of slaves into this Mexican territory. And they also want them to convert to the Catholic religion. And so a lot of these Americans are just, well, saying no, they don't want to do that. And so Mexico was starting to talk about sending them back to the United States. So they revolt at the city of Sonoma in 1846. So this is a Bear Flag Revolt. They are successful. They beat the Mexican troops that come in. And so for about a month, California is an independent nation. But then this is the point when the United States will claim California as their own territory. So this is as the Mexican War is really starting to heat up here. All right, so a video here on our flag and its story.
The first flags in what is now the American state of California were those of the European colonial empires of the Spanish and Russians that explored and traded there. California became part of Mexico when that country gained independence in 1821. Alta California remained a northern province in Mexico until 1846, when the short-lived California Republic was established. The flag during this period consisted of a white field with a single red star in the outline of a grizzly bear, formerly indigenous to the state, at the top left. The words California Republic appeared below those symbols and a red horizontal stripe at the bottom of the flag. California was ceded to the United States from Mexico in 1848 after the Mexican-American War. California was admitted as a 31st state in 1850. The following year, in 1851, a 31st star was added to the national flag. California continued to see changes in the national flag until the present 50-star flag. The state flag of California was inspired by the flag of the California Republic and includes a similar single red star and a red stripe along the bottom. A grizzly bear appears in the center with the words California Republic below. The bear on the current flag was modeled after the last wild California grizzly bear named Monarch. Monarch was captured in 1889 and spent time in San Francisco zoos until his death in 1911, the same year the current state flag was adopted. The bear was mounted and is preserved at the Academy of Sciences at Golden Gate Park. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button.
Okay, there you go. So there is the background on why we have a bear on our flag. So grizzlies were indigenous to California. So back in the day, there were quite a few grizzlies. And so that is where we get the name of the Bear Flag Revolt. All right, so other California symbols like the state tree, the California redwood, you may be familiar with those if you've gone to any of our local state parks. Some of them are big enough to even drive through. So this is the chandelier tree. Unfortunately, I don't think you can drive through it anymore. I think it was damaged in the last year or two. I think our cars have just gotten too big in the intervening years here. But they are just massive, massive trees. So very, very cool to go and see those. All right, so of course our state flower is the California poppy. So this is a wildflower. And I was always told as a child that it was illegal to pick California poppies. And so I thought this would be a good time for me to research this and say, is that really true? Or was that just something that my mother told me so that I wouldn't pick her flowers? But it ends up that it is true. So, you're not going to be prosecuted if you're picking them out of someone's lawn. But if you are picking them on state property, you very much can be. So like if you're at Redwood National Park, you could face a fine of $1,000 or 6 months in jail. So I think we'll just leave those poppies right where they are. All right, so back to our timeline and our last major topic today, and that is the Civil War. So this is always kind of a weird term for students because obviously a war is not civil. So we talk about what that word civil means. That's usually, you're being nice to someone, you're being civil, you're being polite, you're tolerating them. The Civil War, and what that means is that this is a war that's fought within a nation rather than between two different countries. So some other historical examples would be the English Civil War or the Chinese Civil War. So the major causes of the Civil War, absolutely number one cause is the institution of slavery. That was where everything else was falling apart. So we were arguing over slave states and free states, and we just get to a point where we just can't compromise anymore. So after 1850. And then for a lot of southern states like South Carolina, the election of Abraham Lincoln is the straw that breaks the camel's back. So in some southern states, his name won't even appear on the ballot. So that's how upset they are about him running for president. So he does win the election, and that is the point when South Carolina will be the first state to secede. So these are our two sides, so the Union and the Confederacy. So the red states, those are the Confederate states. So these are all the states that will end up seceding. The blue states are the Union states. And then the lighter blue states, just a little bit of a confusing concept to students, but feel free to try to explain it. Those are the border states. So some of these states are just not allowed to secede, like the state of Maryland. And partially the big reason for that is that Washington, D.C. is actually in Maryland. So President Lincoln was not about to allow Maryland to secede. And then some others they decide to stay. The state of Kentucky stays in large part because of Henry Clay. He has died by this point, but this was seen as a tribute to Henry Clay. You know, how could they possibly secede, when their senator for so many decades had worked hard to keep the Union together? So they will stay a border state. All right, so advantages of each side. So the North has a very large population. So there are about 30 million people living in the northern states or the Union states versus 8 million in the Confederacy. So that is a huge advantage. So they are going to be able to outlast the Confederacy because they just have so many more people. This is an offensive war for the Union. You know, they're not fighting in their own territory for the most part. Gettysburg will be kind of one of the great exceptions here. But for the most part, most of the battles are happening in the South. They have a lot more money. They have a functioning government. The Confederacy has to kind of start over. They have to elect a president, and they have to figure out how the Congress is going to work and all of that. All the industry is in the North. So all of the early factories that we have going on, that's all in the North. The railroad is all in the North, and the banking system as well. Now, the South does have some advantages as well, but they're not quite as many. So they are fighting for their homes because the battles are happening in the South. So I think it's nice to, especially if you have an athlete in your home, you can talk about home field advantage, of how that's an advantage that, you know, if this is a soccer field or a baseball field, that you're familiar with, you know, kind of where the spots are, where the grass is missing, and that sort of thing. So same kind of advantage here for our Confederates. Better generals in the South, like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, all of the military schools were in the South, so they had much better generals. And they have an agricultural system, so it's going to be easier for them to be growing food for their troops. All right, then this is a time to do some main idea and claim practice. So I do an example with them for the South because they're going to be doing one on the North. So my example is the South had better generals than the North. This was the biggest advantage in the Civil War because they could possibly win more battles. And so then they can write out a claim about one of the North's advantages and why they think it was the most important. So here's a student example from this morning. The North had a bigger advantage because they have more population, 30 million versus 8 million. So they have 4 times as many people as the South does. All right, so important people of the Civil War. I think it's a good time to talk about Abraham Lincoln and anything that you know about him that you want to share with your student. That he had a long career as a senator, so involved in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So he's from Illinois. George McClellan, prior to finding some generals later in the war, like General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who will go on to be a U.S. president later as well, he's kind of stuck with George McClellan. And he's not a big fan. He thinks that George McClellan is too cautious. And in fact, he will fire him a couple of times, but he just doesn't have that many options because all of the good generals are in the South. So like Robert E. Lee, so definitely the most notable of all of the generals in the South. So once the war ends, the Southerners are not going to lose a bunch of territory like you might see with a typical ending of a war. The one exception, though, was the estate or the house of Robert E. Lee. If you've been to Arlington Cemetery, you've been to Robert E. Lee's home. So his home is taken by the government to be turned into a historic graveyard. All right, so the average soldier that is fighting in this war is very, very young. This is a great time to practice using some data with our students. So using a pie chart here, and I just walk them through each slice of this pie, and then that largest slice you have, that 70%, are between the age of 16 and 23, which is, of course, extremely young. The average age of the soldiers fighting in the Civil War was 19. So very much on the young side. Should be noted too that they actually weren't supposed to be in the war if they were under the age of 16, but a lot of them would lie about their age so that they could fight. Okay, so just a picture here, kind of our average soldiers. You can definitely see how young some of them are. And then have them go through and see if they can figure out what these items are. So they might have a good idea about a couple of them, and then I'll walk through each one on the next slide. So you can see there's silverware and a canteen and a frying pan and a blanket, and you know, there's stamps and money and a Bible, and you know, this would be a good time too to have a conversation about why you think they would bring what they brought. And what they wore. Important to note that our Confederate uniform, and I would use that term loosely because a lot of times they didn't have uniforms. They just wore what they would wear, you know, out in the fields, whereas the North has more money, so you're going to see more of a typical uniform there with the blue on the right. And these are some of the things that they would be eating. So a lot of, you know, bacon and kind of soft bread and hardtack. So hardtack is, I think the closest thing we have to it today is like a saltine, but not even like as crunchy as a saltine, so a little bit on the softer side there. How they communicated, obviously writing letters is going to be a huge relief or release for a lot of these soldiers. So this is a good time to do a letter writing activity. So this is good for them to getting some perspective and other people's point of views. I have them pretend that they're a Union soldier, and they're going to write home about what their daily life is like. And they can talk about how old they are, what their experience is, are they scared, you know, do they regret joining the war effort, and that sort of thing. All right, and then the technology of the Civil War. So sometimes the Civil War is called the first modern war because we're seeing a lot of new technology. It's not just new technology with weaponry, which we definitely are. The rifle is a big step up from the musket, which were just so inaccurate. And you know, different types of bullets and that sort of thing. But photography is a very new medium or a new art form that's being used at this time. So it's really the first war that is being documented in more or less real time versus people doing paintings. Picture on the right there is a photo of one of the ways they were doing reconnaissance. So this is with a hot air balloon. And so they would float these hot air balloons to find out information about where troop movements were. The telegraph, so this is an image on the right there of Lincoln in the telegraph office. So sometimes he would just spend all night there keeping track of where the different troop movements were and that sort of thing. For the first time, we have canned food for the soldiers. So this picture on the left is something that has been found later. Obviously, this is not what it would look like when they were eating out of it. And so that was a brand new thing. So it could keep food fresher a little bit longer, but it also is going to add a lot more weight in their pack. So downside to that. The railroad, which we talked about in depth last week. So you should have a lot of information on that. But again, just reminding ourselves that the vast majority of the tracks are all in the North. So the North is going to be utilizing the railroad to move troops and material. We also have ironclads for the first time. So each side has one. This is going to be a really important change. So we're not really going to be using wooden ships anymore after this in the United States. So they're going to resist fire a lot more than our wooden ships did. So the Merrimack and the Monitor will clash. The Monitor will sink. So there'll be a project to actually bring back the Monitor. We also have our first form of submarines, but as you can see, very, very rough. They're very, very rudimentary. You know, this looks really nothing like our modern day submarines, but the first time that we can have ships underwater. So the Civil War ends in 1865. Just huge loss of life, you know, especially for the Confederacy. So 30% of Confederate men aged 18 to 40 die over the course of this war. So this is going to be just a huge uphill battle from here on out for our southern states to try to catch up. More people are going to die due to disease than to actual injuries happening in the battle. So the surrender happens at a place called Appomattox. And then we're going to see some constitutional amendment or some laws that are going to be passed after this that will make slavery illegal all over the United States. So these are called the Reconstruction Amendments. So this is Amendment 13, 14, and 15. Abraham Lincoln will sadly die not long after the end of the war. And so he had planned to, guide our nation through this transition of, trying to put our country back together in a very gentle way. But because he dies before he can do that, it's a rough transition for sure. I think this is a really valuable chart. Students were pretty shocked by it this morning. So you can see just the sheer number of deaths from the Civil War, over 620,000 deaths in this war. And when you compare that to other wars that we've been involved in the 20th century, you've got World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Korea, the Revolutionary War, even from way earlier on, and then our current numbers in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it really gives us some perspective of the sheer loss of life that happens here. So what's going on with California in the Civil War? There are absolutely no battles that are happening in California because we are literally on the other side of the country. But both sides are lobbying us for support, but we go with the Union. So both sides are interested in California because of our gold deposits. There were a few groups in Southern California that wanted to secede. They wanted to join the Confederacy, but they were minimal. There was also some concern that England might actually invade California because everyone else was distracted by all the fighting going on in the East and the South. So because of that fear, this is where we really start to beef up protections at places like Fort Point and Alcatraz. So this is the California Battalion. There are thousands of Californians that will volunteer. They will get on the railroad and they will travel east to go fight in the Civil War. So even though no battles are happening in California, there's definitely a contribution for the Union Army from Californians. All right, and that's going to take us to our final project. The students just loved, and their parents did too. So the project is to make a parade float celebrating California becoming a state. It's a nice way to kind of put together all the things that we've learned so far. So it's a nice way to kind of culminate or put it all together. So I try to ask them if they've been to a parade and seen a parade float and kind of what the purpose of that is. And so our purpose is going to be to celebrate California becoming a state. And so they can either just draw this on a piece of paper, but we made one kind of with a diorama. We have a lot of boxes laying around the house right now. So that's what we used. And so I've got some pictures in here that you could see some examples. So that's my daughter on the right there. So that's Callie. We did a couple printouts there. So we have our poppies, and she made a railroad out of cardboard. We have our covered wagon of someone going west to find gold. We incorporated some Legos in there as well. And then we have a couple other examples here too from some other students that participated today. So there's Clark with he's got his bears and his redwood trees there as well. All right, a couple more there. So there's Lucia with her California Republic. So she's made the California state flag, and Linnea there too. So she's got a lot of representatives of, we've got the Civil War there and the poppy, and she's got the California quail. So a really fun exercise to, get those art juices flowing and give them something fun to do, and you can get rid of one more box in your house. So hopefully that was all helpful. As always, any feedback I would love to have, and hope the rest of your homeschooling adventures are going well.